Welcome to the new Transatlantic Cable, a tripartite civil engineering history webinar series. The webinars are coordinated by the History and Heritage Committee of the American Society of Civil Engineers, the National History Committee of the Canadian Society for Civil Engineering, and the Panel for Historical Engineering Works of the Institution of Civil Engineers. Today's installment, recorded on the 30th of March, 2022, features David R. Gilbert presenting David Thompson's surveying and mapping of the Northwest of North America.
Hello and welcome. My name is Vahid Ayan. I'm a member of Canadian Society for Civil Engineers National History Committee, and I'll be your host today for our ASCE, CSE, and ICE Tripartite Civil Engineering History webinar. It's now my pleasure to introduce our speaker, David R. Gilbert. David is a 1960 mining engineering graduate of Colorado School of Mines, who spent an international career mostly with Bechtel Corporation, construction, mining, and oil field facilities, and oil refineries and petrochemical plants. In his retirement, he spent 13 years with the ASCE History and Heritage Committee and is now into his fourth year as a corresponding member. He resides with his Australian wife, Lynn, in Skowhegan, Washington. Dave, welcome, and the floor is yours. Please proceed.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I'm Dave Gilbert. Our topic today is David Thompson. David Thompson was a surveyor for the big fur trading companies in Canada from 1790 until 1814. He worked for 13 years with the Hudson Bay Company of London, and then another 17 years with the Northwest Company of Montreal. He traveled extensively throughout the Canadian interior and the U.S. states of Minnesota, North Dakota, Montana, Idaho, and Washington, way out to the Pacific Ocean. He made very accurate surveys as he went on all these trips. And then he later compiled them into a large map that showed almost 1.7 million square miles of the North American interior. By comparison, this is about half of the area of the United States, and it's a little bit greater than the size of the current European Union. In his final years, he wrote a narrative of all these travels. And it was found many years later by a Canadian mining geologist by the name of J.B. Tyrrell. And it prompted him to declare David Thompson as the greatest land geographer who ever lived. I think it's a fair accolade, and he was a pretty extraordinary man. Last December, the American Society of Civil Engineers and the Canadian Society for Civil Engineers jointly designated David Thompson's work as a international historic civil engineering landmark. So today we'll talk about David's early life, his surveying work with the Hudson Bay Company, surveying with the Northwest Company, and then his remarkable marriage to Charlotte Small, and then his Columbia River surveys, which were quite an important part of his work. And then his retirement, and then his maps and his memoirs. So David was born in London, April 30th, 1770, to Welsh parents. They were quite poor. David was enrolled in the Greycoat School, which is was quite near Westminster Abbey in London. This plaque we see here recognizes his time there, and then his work later on in Canada. He learned algebra, geometry, navigation, all intended to prepare young men for the Royal Navy. But by the time he ended his studies, the Navy was not looking for recruits. So David Thompson instead was sent to work with the Hudson Bay Company on Churchill, at Churchill in central Canada. His earliest work was clerical, but pretty soon he was sent out on field missions in parts of what are now Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. 1788, he was out in Saskatchewan. He fell down a bank and very severely broke his leg. It was a very slow, severe injury, a very slow recovery. And he pretty soon moved east to Cumberland House, which is also in the eastern part of Saskatchewan. There he met Philip Turner, who was Hudson Bay Company's first surveyor. Turner took a liking to Thompson, recognized his math skills, so he began teaching him in practical surveying. So from then on, Thompson was hooked, and he developed an unending passion for surveying. And he was said later that the accident was the best thing that ever happened to me. So let's just briefly look at Philip Turner's life. He was a pretty remarkable man in his own right. He was 12 years with the Hudson Bay Company. He traveled about 15,000 miles throughout the Canadian interior, mostly to the west and south of Hudson's Bay. His last work was mapping Lake Athabasca, which is up in the very far north of Alberta. Produced about 10 major maps. His last one, which he completed in 1794, was 6.5 feet high, 8.5 feet, 6.5 feet high, 8.5 feet wide. And it's now in the archives of Manitoba. It's considered now one of Canada's great cartographic treasures. Towards the end, he felt the Hudson Bay Company was not giving him the support he needed. He went back to England in 1792 and never did return to Canada. Before he left, though, he urged the Hudson Bay Company to name David Thompson as the chief surveyor. Turner left behind a pre-wife and some of their children. These so-called country marriages were a common thing at that time, usually just temporary alliances where European traders would return home, leave their native wives and offspring behind to reunite with the tribes. In London, he married an English woman, completed work on his maps, taught navigation for a while, but died very poor, 1800. So David Thompson missed the opportunity to go to the Athabasca region with Turner. But in the meantime, he practiced what Turner had taught him. When he was practicing solar observations, he lost the sight in his right eye. So here we have one of history's great surveyors start his career with a very severe visual disability. So before Turner had returned from the Lake Athabasca region, Thompson had recovered well enough to do some surveying work on his own. He did surveys of Saskatchewan, Alberta, Churchill River. Then in 1794, Hudson Bay Company named him as their chief surveyor. So some of the methods that Thompson would have used for his surveys were pretty standard for the time. He made repeated astronomical observations at various key points like trading posts, major geographical features. He averaged these so that they would be accurate. And he probably would have observed Jupiter's moons to determine Greenwich time and also the sun's peak altitude for local time. He would have used pocket watches to keep time between these readings. And from these then he could compute longitudes. Here's a sketch by C.W. Jeffries. Shows him using an artificial horizon of Mercury. Mercury probably stored in that small flask just near David's right foot. Now, the sketch does show David using his blind right eye. We can forgive Jeffries for that. I think it's a very nice sketch of how Thompson may have appeared. So then, once Thompson had these fixed points, he would fill in the detail between by compass estimated distance traverses, which would have been by canoe or on horseback or on foot. By 1787, the Hudson Bay Company was interested in westward expansions, and so they discouraged any more survey work by Thompson. He was pretty disappointed at this, of course, so he quit the Hudson Bay Company, went to work for their rival, which was the Northwest Company of Montreal. And here he meets another famous Canadian figure, Alexander Mackenzie. Mackenzie was a founder and a senior partner of the Northwest Company and very commerce-minded. He wanted to expand the operations to the west, to the Pacific, and then onward to China. This, of course, suited Thompson just fine. So we'll come back to Mackenzie again a little bit later. His first year with the Northwest Company, Thompson was pretty busy. He surveyed these regions here in the Assiniboine River Basin. He went down into what's now North Dakota to the Mandan villages, which are here on the Missouri River. And then he worked his way east into what's now northern Minnesota and identified the source of the Mississippi River. He then surveyed his way around Lake Superior, back along the northern boundary and down to about this point, just in here, be just about in here. That was Grand Portage, which was the field headquarters for the Northwest Company. When he finished this 10 months of surveying, Mackenzie remarked that Thompson had performed more in 10 months than what he expected could be done in more than 2 years. Quite a compliment from a man like Mackenzie. So in 1799, another big event occurred in David's life. He married Charlotte Small. Charlotte was the daughter of Patrick Small, who was a Scottish trader for the Northwest Company and a Cree mother. Now, this was not an ordinary country marriage. It lasted 57 years. They had 13 children together. Charlotte and children often traveled with David on his treks. There's a monument at Invermere, BC, showing them both. It was done by Alberta sculptor Rich Ronish. Charlotte was very helpful to David in these trips. She established very good relationships with various tribes. This helped him to organize trade with them and learn the local geography, which was, of course, very important. She was very deservedly named as a Canadian National Historic Person in 2008. So now we go to the Columbia Brigade work, which is one of David's major accomplishments. To do that, we need to go back briefly here to Alexander Mackenzie to sort of set the stage. And said before, Mackenzie, a hard-driving Scot, very brave, bent on finding his way to a Pacific port. The Rocky Mountains were a major barrier to this plan. Finding a suitable pass over these mountains and then a navigable river on the other side was pretty critical to the plan. Mackenzie was among the first people to try. He made 2 very famous trips, search for the Pacific. Here's his map showing those 2 trips. The first was 1789 up the Mackenzie River. It's just here, just in here somewhere. Mackenzie comes out of starts at Great Slave Lake in the far north of Canada. The purpose was to learn if the river connected to the Pacific Ocean. Well, he learned it didn't, because it emptied instead into the Arctic Ocean. So it was not a route that he was looking for or could use to the Pacific. Then he made another second trip in 1793, and that was up the Peace River and just in here. And he crossed over the Rockies on a very short portage, went partway down what's now the Fraser River, but he wrongly assumed that it was actually the Columbia River. And we see the projection going way down here. The Columbia River is actually just in here, but he was in a hurry to beat the winter, so he made a shortcut over the coastal range just here, and he found an Indian village called Bella Coola, which is right here on one of the deep fjords on the Pacific shore. So in doing so, he became first European to cross North America by land. It was not Lewis and Clark, as many people are apt to believe. Mackenzie beaten them by full 13 years. So when Thompson starts to explore the Columbia River in 1807, he's aware of Mackenzie's work, which was out here up near the northwest corner of this map. He also knew that Lewis and Clark had come down the Snake River, found the Columbia River at this point B, and from where the Columbia flows to the Pacific Ocean. So his goal was now clear. He had to get from point A, just up here, to point B here. In between was a blank slate. Now, the topography and all of this region west of the Rocky Mountains in this part of Alberta, British Columbia, Canada, and the northwestern United States is some of the most rugged country in the world. And the river patterns are extremely complex. So here's the reality. It's a tangled mess of rivers. It took David Thompson about 4 years to unravel this puzzle. We have to keep in mind that he also had to attend to the fur trading business, which meant a trip east every year back to Grand Portage. So his exploring time was rather limited. It took him down, this work took him down 6 tributaries of the Columbia River, which are shown here in pink. I don't have time to describe the fascinating details of all this work, so I have to do a quick summary, and here's what happened. He began up here near what's now Calgary, Alberta. He found and crossed over Howes Pass over the Rockies, and then down the western side to down the western side on the Blaeberry River. And here at the mouth of the Blaeberry, he found it emptied into a very large river running to the north. Now, because it was going north, David Thompson quite reasonably assumed that it was not the Columbia River because it was going wrong direction. But little do you know, he was actually on the Columbia, and he found it on his first crossing of the mountains. So at this point, he went south up the river to its source, which is just here. It's near the present day location of Invermere, BC. A local guide then showed him across the flats to the Kootenai River, which is this one just here. Well, Thompson spent a lot of time exploring down the Kootenai, runs into the northwest corner of the state of Montana just here, then northwest into the very northern panhandle of Idaho state, which is just in here. Then it runs north again, back into British Columbia, into a long lake here known as Kootenai Lake. Thompson discovered that the outfall of this lake, which does run to the Columbia, was far too rough to travel by canoe, and the topography was extremely rough absolutely no good for a portage. So he had to give that up. Next season, he came back from Grand Portage, crossed over Howells Pass, up to the Source Lake, down the Kootenai to this point right here, which is now near Bonners Ferry, Idaho. And there he learned of an overland trail, Indian trail, that led to a point down here on the Pend Oreille River, which is now the location of Sandpoint, Idaho. So he explored down the Pend Oreille River a couple of times. Again, just about here at what's now Medellin Falls in Washington State, he found falls and rapids that were just impassable by canoe. And again, the country was just far too rough to portage. So again, he was very close to his Columbia River here, but he didn't know it. So back east again, returned in 1810 to this point right here. He found his way blocked Howells Pass. The Kootenai Indian tribes were angry, and they had accused him of arming their pagan enemies who lived to the east of them. Actually, he hadn't done so. But he was forced to retreat from Howells Pass, and winter was beginning to set in. So he regrouped his men, looked for another way over the Rocky Mountains. And he found it at Athabasca Pass, which is at the head of the Athabasca River. Here's another very nice sketch by Jeffries, which shows David Thompson trudging up over this pass on snowshoes, his men behind him carrying goods. The other side, he went down to the Canoe River, and it flows into a very large river. Is it the Columbia? Yes, it is. Thompson doesn't know this, of course, but this is where the Columbia makes a sharp bend from flowing to the north and then to the south. Thompson by now knows that Simon Fraser had recently discovered that the Fraser River actually enters the Pacific Ocean at this point right here, which is quite near present-day Vancouver, British Columbia. So he knows that that's not the Columbia River as Mackenzie had assumed incorrectly years before. So now the spring thaw comes. Thompson knows that his provisions are very low. His men's morale probably not much better. And he decides it's best to travel back upriver to Kootenai House, which he'd established just there, to get fresh provisions, give his men a break. It was likely a wise choice. Going down this river, unknown river, no supplies, could have been a fatal mistake. So down the Kootenai he goes again to this point, Bonners Ferry, across the flats, what's now Sand Point, down the Medellin a little bit, then overland to the Spokane House. It's on the Spokane River, and his men had built this post while he was on his way to the trip back east. He tried to get down the Spokane River, very rough, very broken. Then he learned about another river to the north from a local tribesman. It's now called the Colville River. Very easy going. He followed it down, found it. It joined a very, very large river. So this is Kettle Falls, Washington State. This is Washington State just here. The falls are now submerged under the Grand Coulee Dam pool. Coulee Dam's just in here. So finally, Thompson thinks that he's probably solved this puzzle. So here's what he knows at this time. Big river here at the Canoe River mouth. He's now here at Kettle Falls. There's a big river here. He knows the Columbia's down here. So Now he needs to connect the dots. So he quickly builds some canoes here at Kettle Falls, travels down the Columbia, takes a big sweep through eastern Washington state, finally arrives at the Snake River just here. Now he knows where he is. So he travels down the Columbia to what's now Astoria, stays only a few days, and then quickly travels back upstream to the Snake River, finds some horses, takes a shortcut over here to Spokane House on the Spokane River, immediately goes to Kettle Falls, builds another fleet of canoes. They're getting good at this now. Travels upstream to the Canoe River. So now in doing so, become the first European to travel the entire 2,000-mile length of the Columbia River. 80% of it, all of this for the first time. Now he's opened up this huge area for the Northwest Company. He's found a good route over Athabasca Pass, then down the Columbia to the Pacific Ocean. It was used for many, many years by the fur trade. So he crosses back over Athabasca Pass and back at Grand Portage, decides he'll retire. So, unlike with a lot of other fur traders, he took Charlotte and their children with him to Montreal, and there they set up a home. They were there for 2 years, and then they moved north to Williamstown, Ontario, sorry. And they lived for another 20 years there. And the plaque marks this house. It was built in 1804, and it still stands to this day. In 1813-14, he worked on his great map. It covered all of the areas he traveled. Here's Hudson Bay, Lake Superior, the Pacific Ocean, and these are all of his travels in his time in the field. This is the great map hanging in the archives of Ontario. This is a copy that is displayed in the reading room of the archives. It's 6.5 feet high, 10 feet wide, made up of 25 individual sheets that Thompson had glued together with a good old mucilage. The chief of the Northwest Company at the time, William McGillivray, probably very amazed at seeing this whole chunk of the continent on the table in front of him. It was really a valuable asset for the Northwest Company. The Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company merged later in 1821. The Hudson Bay Company allowed this map to be published by Errol Smith, a cartographer in London, and no credit was given to Thompson at all. Another copy of his map exists at the replica of Fort William in the Kaministiquia River in Thunder Bay, Ontario, on the northern shore of Lake Superior. The Northwest headquarters was moved here from Grand Portage, Minnesota, when the U.S.-Canadian border was surveyed, and the Grand Portage was found to be on the United States side. Very sadly, Thompson made some bad business investments, lost the fortune that he'd accumulated with the Northwest Company. He was forced to do local surveying jobs. Then he later worked on the United States-Canadian boundary surveys. He was very disappointed with the Oregon Boundary Resolution in 1846. It had agreed that the border would be the 49th parallel between the United States and British North America. rather than the Columbia River, which Thompson had spent so much effort and time in learning its topography and local geography. And he was beginning to lose his already poor vision. So he began work at 75 years old on his great narrative. It was 702 handwritten pages, covered many, many topics, such as botany, geology, the meteorology, and of all the places he visited. And it went missing for more than a century. Found, as we said, by J.B. Terrell. He had it published as David Thompson's narrative of his travels in Western America from 1784, 1812. Became and still is quite a valuable resource for early Canadian history researchers. So finally, David Thompson died penniless in Montreal, February 10th, 1857. Charlotte died just 3 months later. They're buried together here at Mount Royal Cemetery in Montreal. It's marked by this column. See the sextant on the top? It's unfortunately now been removed because of security concerns. But worst of all, Thompson died with no recognition at all for his accomplishments. He contributed so much to the development of Canada. So the Canadian Society of Civil Engineers planned to display the plaque honoring his work at the reconstructed Fort William near Thunder Bay in Ontario. Two ASCE sections of Minnesota, Montana. They've also participated in this nomination, and they plan to display plaques at places that are as yet undecided. So in closing, here we have David Thompson, the greatest land geographer to have lived. He and his contemporaries, Mackenzie, Turner, still remain relatively unknown outside of Canada. Too often they're overshadowed by the very popular accounts of Lewis and Clark, who really accomplished much less than any of the three of them. Charlotte Small, his lifelong wife and companion, gave him a great deal of insight into the native cultures of early Canada, allowed him to work very harmoniously with him. She's truly a Canadian National Historic person. Surveying and mapping accomplishments of Thompson were unprecedented in magnitude, and his writings today are a scientific treasure. So, thank you very much, Michael Bartlett, my friend and chair of the Canadian Society National History Committee. He prepared all of the slides for this and the maps, and he also took on a very hard task of finalizing the nomination of Thompson's work as a civil engineering landmark. His Canadian Society of Civil Engineering History Committee people also helped out a great deal on that. Cole Bedford of our ASCE History and Heritage Committee did a lot of work on finalizing the nomination. So many thanks out to him too. And also many thanks to Alistair Mackenzie, my good friend, former president of the Canadian Society for Civil Engineering. 12 years ago, he inspired me to learn more about David Thompson. And this is what led finally to nominating his work as a landmark. Lastly, Claire Christie, Holly Ellis, two ladies from Sandpoint, Idaho, took these photos of David Thompson's statue there. It's so representative of Thompson that we used it twice in the presentation. For additional reading, if you're interested, Sources of the River by Jack Nesbitt is an excellent book on David Thompson. Barry Goff's First Across the Continent is an excellent account of Mackenzie's life. And finally, Mapmaker by Barbara Mitchell is a very, very well-researched, easy reading story about Philip Turner. And she incidentally is a descendant of his Metis family, and she's taught also at Trent University there in Ontario. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Now it's time for Q&A, question and answer. So feel free to raise your hand using the Zoom typical feature and ask any question if you have any. Also, you guys can put the question on the chat box of the Zoom, and we will provide the answer. Larry Magora asked that it appears that Thompson followed part of the route of the Lewis and Clark expedition by only a few years. Was Thompson aware of Lewis and Clark? Did he have access to any of their reports? David, do you want to respond?
Yes. Hello, Gordon. Yeah, David Thompson traveled primarily by canoe. Those were the highways in the fur trading days. And when they did have to portage, it was often on foot, where they had to backpack the supplies around the rapids and over the falls. They did use horses, I think, frequently. His teams, I'm not sure of the size of them, but I think typically in these explorations, it was probably 8 to 10 people. Yeah, the trips were generally done in several canoes. They were very large, designed to carry the heavy freight, the furs, and all the provisions that they needed. So, and I think the last part of your question was, did he have access to other reports? He would have certainly Mackenzie's work, because they were with the same company and were both partners in the organization. He would have. He did learn of Lewis and Clark's work, so at Leahy's Columbia River explorations, he knew of a good fix where Lewis and Clark had come down the Snake and found the Columbia. So does that cover it, Gordon?
Sure, that wasn't my question, Dave, but that was a very good question and an excellent answer.
Sorry.
I could, Vahid, if it's okay, I could go on to my question I put in the Q&A.
Oh, that's your question.
It was about how to convey the intrepid achievement of Thompson and his contemporaries to a world where young people take satellite observation for granted, and they see images from space and they say, what's the big deal about creating a map of Canada, the US, etc. How do we get any ideas for how to get over and get across the stunning achievement that they had with the tools that they had available to them?
That's an interesting question, Gordon, and I think it's in a lot of ways difficult. As you say, we're blessed with so many new technologies that make it so simple that very hard for a lot of younger people today is to imagine the tribulations these people went through. And really, to cover his work here in this short period, it's a little hard to describe some of these, but the bitter cold and the mosquitoes and the flies and the trudging miles around these portages with heavy loads. And in the far north on Lake Athabasca, where Turner finished up his work, that's a remote country even today. I've worked just south of there at Fort McMurray in northern Alberta, and believe you me, the winters there are bitter. And yeah, it's a tough thing to convey, but it was hard going.
For sure.
Probably we can make a computer game or app for the young generation. Yeah, it will have.
Yeah, I might add that I found it quite character building trying to trace these routes on an electronic map. It's a very complicated terrain to try to understand. Dave, thanks. That was a lovely presentation. One of the things that I think we need to add about David Thompson is that he was generations ahead of his time in terms of his dealings with the indigenous people. He spoke 4 or 5 indigenous languages. He did not like the idea that alcohol should be traded for furs. He was firmly against that. He actually was given an indigenous name, which I've forgotten right now, but you know, right now there's a Canadian Indigenous group that's visiting the Vatican this week to talk about some pretty horrible things that happened in Canadian history. And Thompson seems to be kind of 200 years ahead of his time about that.
We have 2 more questions. Dave Ennis asked that, can you comment on Thompson's work on establishing the Northwest Angle, establishing the boundary between Minnesota and Manitoba?
Yes, David Thompson, as I said, did work on the U.S.-Canadian boundary survey in his later years, just prior to when his site became too poor to survey any longer. I've not carefully studied that portion of Thompson's life, only to know that he did play a very key role with the U.S.-Canadian Boundary Commission when that survey was made. The establishment of that boundary has some very interesting aspects about it, particularly north of the woods, where it's necessary for the U.S. people to travel through a bit of Canada just to get to a piece of America that's isolated there. And the same occurs out here in Washington State, where the boundary chopped off a small peninsula that juts down into American territory. And it again has to be accessed via Canada for Americans to get to this little chunk of territory. Very interesting story, and it's almost a presentation of its own, I think.
So, okay, the next question is, you mentioned that Jupiter's moons as a time reference for surveying. Can you elaborate on this method?
Can you repeat that, please,
yes,
again?
Sure. Yes, you mentioned Jupiter's moons as a time reference for surveying. Can you elaborate on this method?
Yes, I think it was probably one of several methods, but by observing Jupiter's moons, and I think there's 6 or 7 of them or so forth, they do revolve around Jupiter and they're visible by telescope. And astronomers have established that these moons appear and disappear at times that they can relate to Greenwich Mean Time. So in the field, this is quite an accurate way of determining Greenwich time, which of course is vital to determining longitude where you are. And then that's compared to what's local noon when the sun crests. And knowing the time difference between Greenwich and when you observe the zenith of the sun, that's longitude. And so that's the way it works. I know it's very condensed description, but best I can do in the time here allowed, I think.
I see Nigel raised his hand.
I was just going to make a facetious comment about young people, and they should be made to carry a canoe through a no-see-em infested piece of water and then just see how they like it.
So has anyone approached CBC with the idea to have a program produced on the life and works of Thompson? The CBC, like the Canadian TV channel. So I think this is something that probably Mike or someone from
I'm not aware of that, but
Yeah.
maybe some of the other members of the National History Committee, I think Alistair and Peter Wright might know more about this than I do, but I'm not aware of anything like that. It would be a fabulous story.
Yeah, it will be. Also, I see another question in our chat box. So is the Thompson River named after him?
In Montana, yes.
Yeah, okay.
I do believe it is. He actually, it wasn't shown on the maps, but Thompson did establish some trading posts well up the river from Sandpoint, Idaho. That river is known as the Clark Fork. It's really just a natural extension of the Pend Oreille River. But yes, he did get up to Thompson Falls, Montana, and that may well be where Minnesota section or Montana section might like to erect this plaque.
Excellent, thank you. I think we don't have other question, but there was great question answer. So thank you for your attendance.
The new transatlantic cable webinars are coordinated by a tripartite ad hoc committee that includes the individuals shown here.